Namaskar. Hello and welcome to 𝗣𝗚𝘂𝘁 channel. I'm your host Sree Iyer. I am with Rami N Desai. Ramiji has been on our channel before. We've discussed about Manipur, and this time we're going to take the thing and broaden it a little bit more because the conflict appears to have been, I'm not saying these are connected, but they're disconnected even, let's say that way. Myanmar in the state of Shan is seeing a lot of turbulence right now. And today's news is that 39 soldiers of Myanmar, they had to escape the conflict. They had to come into Mizoram. Then from there, they were brought into Manipur. And then from Manipur, they went back to Myanmar. So there is some cooperation on part of the Indian Army to help the Myanmar Army to escape from the conflict zone. Ramiji, what is really happening now? Who is taking what side? Because I'm hearing there are 5 units that are fighting the Myanmar Army. Unpack it a little bit for us. What is really going on in Myanmar, and is it related to what played out in Manipur, considering Shan is the biggest producer of opium?
Namaskar, and it is, such a pleasure and privilege for me to be here again with you on your show. Excellent introductory music, by the way. But before I answer your question or we try to unpack this, I have to right at the outset say that you know all of these areas, all of these geographical areas, all of these conflicts are interconnected. Let us not have any confusion in that. These are historical issues, they have historical moorings in it. So it is also not that easy to understand. What we can try to do is touch upon some of the moot points of what we've seen happen in Myanmar and its interconnection with what we've seen happen in Manipur and its interconnection with Myanmar and, of course, neighboring states. You see, the northeastern region of India has the longest border with Myanmar. It has over 1,600 kilometers of border with Myanmar. This border is porous, it's very difficult terrain, and it's not easy to plug. I've said this often that our focus has always been on the northwestern frontier. We hear a lot more talk about it. We hear that people are more informed about what is happening there, but that is only the northwestern frontier with a limited amount of international borders. But if you look at the northeastern frontier, it is far more complex, but because it has borders. For example, Myanmar, over 1,650 kilometers of porous borders, as well as maritime borders. It has borders with Bangladesh, with China. These are the areas that impact us. Whatever happens there impacts India naturally. Now, having said that, there has been a certain amount of unfortunate instability in these countries as well. India has done a good job, let me say, in keeping doors of communication open, because it's very important to have your neighbors on your side. And even with the dispensation change in Myanmar, wherein we see the junta today there, we've kept our channels of communication open, and that spells for good diplomacy. With Bangladesh as well, the dispensation there, we have very good relations with. And post the advent of Sheikh Hasina, we saw a decrease in insurgencies in the Northeast because they stopped getting any sort of support from across the border. So, in a nutshell, this is why our neighbors are important. This is why Myanmar is important. In the in just post independence in the early 50s, 60s, we saw a rise of insurgency in the Northeast, and of course, it was fueled by many reasons. Many international players as well were involved. But let's say the Naga insurgency, the longest running insurgency in the Northeast, only became the longest running insurgency and a formidable insurgency at one point of time. Today, it's lost all steam, and the people of Nagaland and the other areas that were affected by NSCM have, unequivocally, shown their support for being an integral part of India. But there was a time when, because of our policies towards the Northeast of isolation and exclusion, these insurgencies um, gained a lot of momentum. They only were able to gain this momentum because they took the routes via Myanmar into China, where they were given support of not just training and ideology, but also access to weapons and the drug trade. And this could only happen because there were contiguous tribes, by which I mean that similar tribes that we have living in the northeastern region, we have cousin tribes across in Myanmar. And this sort of transnational ethnic tribal support became one of the reasons that they got route to places like China to gain their training. And we have seen that in Manipur as well. This time round in the conflict, we realized that there was a certain amount of transnational support of vested interests. Now, this, under no circumstances do I mean that our brothers and sisters, our communities that live on our side of the border, are in any way involved. But there are vested interests that gain support from across the border, where you already have active insurgent groups that come together and create problems like we've seen in Manipur.
And today, I think Mizoram has either already gone to polls, one phase is over, or the second one. I don't remember the dates, but it's at least poll season in Mizoram. And do you think what happened or still happening in Manipur may have impacted the polls in Mizoram?
See, I think I'm a great believer in the fact that when you give people development and options of industry and so on and so forth, people choose a better future always. And we've seen this happen in the Northeast as well. There was a time when, for a very long time, our policy towards the Northeast was really of ignoring it, of exclusion, of isolation. And these were policies that were carried on by us, which were established by the British. So the colonial powers brought these policies of isolation and exclusion. And we, because we had lack of better knowledge, we didn't have interest, or we thought that, we'd be able to keep areas like countries like China at bay if we didn't, if we didn't make the Northeast look like a very lucrative area. These were bad policies. And in the last 6 or 7 years, and I say this simply as somebody who has traveled over a period of 15 years and I've seen what it was and what it became, um, I realized that nothing trumps development. And with that, I feel that whatever party that promotes development, peace, and these sort of welfare measures will be the choice of the people. I don't think people are stupid to get carried away by conflict that is trying to play on ethnic identities, but in reality is created by vested interests that are anti-national, and by the multi layers of benefits that a lot of anti-state actors gain from this. For example, the drug trade. The drug trade is something that has that makes a lot of money to keep these militia groups running. Now, if you look at what has happened in Myanmar, again, we have to keep coming back to Myanmar because it's all so interconnected. In Myanmar, post the dispensation change, a lot of militia groups have become very, very active because, uh, they are fighting against. They are fighting against the present dispensation. Um, Even international agencies, consider the present dispensation anti-democratic. So they, in other ways, also have some amount of emotional support to these groups that are fighting dispensation in Myanmar. Now, how do they continue this fight? We have to ask ourselves, everything is about money and economy. So what keeps this sort of rebellion alive? Because you need money, you need weapons, you need state of the art weapons, you need food for your cadre, you need to be able to support your cadre. Where does this come from? This comes from the drug trade. So, there is this sort of interconnectivity that we've seen. So drug trade, it's nothing new. It was institutionalized by the colonial powers. Drugs like opium were always used in these areas. They were used as maybe for recreation. But with the colonial era coming in, the colonialists what their ambitions were. And from a recreational use, this became into habitual use, completely sort of, making communities completely dependent on these drugs. Also, these areas, even across India, if you see not just, Rakhine, but and, the Arakan areas, all these areas became very famous for their drug cultivation. And we see the effects and impacts of that drug cultivation on India. You'll be surprised to know that places like Manipur, Mizoram, one of even in this conflict, we heard that one of the big problems was this sort of poppy cultivation that was happening in Manipur, was the question of illegal immigration. So we have to ask ourselves, why is there this illegal immigration? Why are they poppy cultivating here? Because it funds insurgencies. And we saw the impacts of that, not just in terms of insurgencies being funded or, these sort of anti-national groups being funded, but also on the social cultural aspects of these areas. So, if you look at Manipur, once upon a time, Manipur had the highest impact of AIDS, which later we saw in Mizoram as well as the drug trade grew, because, there was so much of landing of the drugs that was, that was manufactured in Myanmar. There was so much of landing in the northeast because, these borders are porous, that the drug use became to such an extent, and it was by injection, and also then second party impact of it, that the HIV numbers were the highest in the country in these areas. So, when we look at these areas, again, I reiterate, we have to look at it from many levels. We have to look at it from the level of a conflict is not just a conflict. It's not just two ethnic tribes clashing. These tribes have lived with each other for a really long time. There are external agencies. There is a drug trade. There are insurgencies. There are conflicts. There's transnational loyalties. And there is political instabilities in these countries that impact us. So we have to look at it in a multi-layered factor. That's why conversations on these areas can never be very short conversations. Therefore, my answers also can never be very short.
No. I think this is a huge education for a lot of us. We are suddenly now realizing that there was an arm of India that was more or less ignored. I think 2014 onwards, it was not look east, as Manmohan Singh ji said. And Narendra Modi ji has been doing act east, and that it will take some time for the rewards to play out.
And he
Manipur,
made great strides.
Very true, very true. So today, how is the situation? I'm sorry, I thought you had finished. Please go ahead.
No, I was saying, and he's made great strides, and therefore, I believe, when you ask me about the Mizoram elections also, I believe that, his mandate of development, will always work, because the infrastructural changes on ground, the reduction of insurgency and conflict on ground, was very, very palpable. Somebody like me, as a woman who used to travel to these areas alone, I was always given instructions by my local contacts that, is time pe jana hai, is time pe nahi jana, be careful, these areas, insurgent groups check. They used to collect road tax, illegal road tax, so be careful there. Don't go beyond, certain areas that were recommended. So there was always the travel used to be terrible, because, the roads were not good. You wouldn't find places to stop. It's a completely different world today. And why will people not realize that? Even Manipur, one of the saddest things about Manipur, and like I always say, I'm not a Kuki, I'm not a Meitei. My observation on Manipur is entirely based on my experience in Manipur. 10 years ago, it used to be so difficult to travel in some of the remoter areas of Manipur because there was always this fear of insurgency. There was always this fear of these groups operating there. Also, it was difficult to travel there because, you didn't have a lot of flights and things like that. In the last 6, 7 years, we've had relative peace. We must never ever forget that. It is only this year, unfortunately, that this kicked off. But in the last 6, 7 years, people started choosing development, started choosing peace. Young people started coming back. I saw restaurants crop up, with the with interiors that could be compared to any restaurant in this, in Delhi or Bombay. I saw kids coming back, and mind you, this was a very big thing because 10 years ago, majority of the children would get away for their college if they could afford it and stay in cities like Bangalore and Delhi. Now, who wants to stay away from their families? So in the last 6, 7 years, we started seeing kids coming back and setting up industry. And this was achievable because of the kind of you know active vision we created, of, like you correctly said, of the Loki's policy that turned into the Actis policy. So those days of isolation and exclusion became a thing of the past. Let me say this, unfortunately, we only have certain things in control because everything that happens across the border impacts us. Now, with military crackdowns following the regime change in Naypyidaw, has caused also many to be displaced. And we've seen the immediate impacts of that. Like, for example, in the Saigang region across Manipur, it was said, and this was said by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, that since the beginning of the coup, the military uh, has had such a massive crackdown that there have been at least 70,000 homes across the country that have been displaced, and 70% of those people, which is about 1.5 million people, have been displaced with minimal humanitarian aid and have tried to come into the northeast region of India. So as we already know that Mizoram has over 40,000, now 50,000 marriages, right? That more. In Manipur, we have people coming in. Of course, we can say, these are militant groups. How do we know that these are not militant groups? And in these areas, you have, in fact, anti-junta insurgent groups. You have the Chin National Army, the Arakan Army. These are all outfits that are operating from just across the border in India. And, as many already know, they have transnational ethnic ties with communities here. So we have to be really careful. We have to be really uh, informed because um, eventually this responsibility, I believe, uh, is India's, for the simple reason that India has a very ambitious plan for the Northeast. With its trilateral highway, with connecting Northeast India to the rest of Southeast Asia, and all of that is going to be jeopardized if we all the countries involved don't come together and play a very active role in curbing these sort of insurgent movements as well as the drug trade. We tend to, and sorry, let me just take a couple of minutes more. We tend to look at international countries to have some amount of interference, investment, or some amount of interest in these areas and what is happening. But I find that successive US, EU, UK policies have failed in these regions because they don't understand these regions. And this was our mistake, 50 years ago also, that we carried on the British policies. We allowed Western vested powers to do what they wanted to. And they didn't really understand the psychology of tribes, ethnic identities, and how these politics play out. The Western powers today have imposed over 26 rounds of sanctions without any understanding of what definitive results do they want on ground, because the fact is sanctions have never brought about any regime change. On the contrary, they have only and only impacted common civilians on ground who get impacted directly by these economic sanctions. And this Western habit of imposing economic sanctions on the basis of, oh, we are trying to bring in democracy. You were not able to bring in democracy in the northwestern frontier. You're not going to be able to do it here. And these again have very long term impacts on on all these areas, and therefore on India, because you've put in these economic sanctions. You've not taken into consideration that 40% of Myanmar's debt is owed to China. Therefore, what is going to happen? You are, in one way you're trying to counter China, but in another way you are going to play in the hands of China, because eventually where is Myanmar going to look? What is it going to look towards? The US has also imposed sanctions on Myanmar's defense ministry and two of its main banks used by Naypyidaw to procure arms and goods from foreign sources. What do you think is going to happen? How is this going to help the situation? Let me also bring in Washington has accused defense ministry of $1 billion worth of material since the coup, and other such. The US Congress has notably passed what is called the HR 597, which is the Burma Unified through Rigorous Military Accountability Act of 2021, which authorizes appropriations to provide humanitarian assistance and other support, in addition to taking upon itself to promote democracy and human rights. So now the wording says other support. Now we can only guess, I can only guess what this other support means, So in situations like this, you towards China. Say I its channels of communication open, irrespective of the dispensation there, because India has to think about its own self first. But we still cannot ignore the role of these countries in creating the kind of imbalances that we are seeing.
Thank you so much, Ramiji. We're having a little bit of network difficulties on your end. We have a few questions from our viewers. With your permission, I can ask them for you. Just one moment, please. A lot of back and forth conversation going on as we are doing this show. Magnet Ranga wants to know, Namaskar. Surely the GOI knows what is happening. There are many external and internal enemies. What can they do to quell the trouble, and how can they prevent recurrence?
See, again, this is a very, very complicated situation. The government of India has done a brilliant job. In the Northeast, there has been a 73 or 74% reduction in insurgency. This has never happened before. So I think we must give credit where credit is due. We have solved colonial age border issues, between our own states. I won't even call them border, I'll call them boundary issues between states within the Northeast, which was not done for 70 years. 73% reduction in insurgency done in the last 7 years, which was not done in 70 years. Great ceasefire agreements have been signed. We have one of the most important agreement that still needs to be completed, but is very well on its way, the 𝗎𝑆𝐶 and IM agreement, as well as agreements with other splinter groups of 𝗎𝑆CN, or negotiations are on at least. These were areas that we had not concentrated on at all. And today we are. So I think government of India is doing what it is and what it can at this point. They also need to be very, very careful, because eventually this also impacts some amount of civilians in these states. And civilian safety, security, and ensuring that there is unity amongst civilians in our state who are being impacted by this conflict is very, very important for GOI. So we don't see a lot of things that are happening on surface, because they're happening behind the channels, and they're happening with great speed. Like I said, this is why it's complicated, is because we have to understand the politics of countries across our borders as well. Myanmar is known as the sacrifice zone. There was an investigation that was done, the Associated Press investigation. And, we have to also understand, new changes in the world. As dependent as we are becoming on green energy, what we're not realizing is that critical earth materials have to come from somewhere. Now, where are they coming from? That's why Myanmar is called a sacrifice zone, because they're coming from countries like Myanmar. Myanmar is one of the 4 countries in the world where you can mine for these really rare critical earth materials. And these materials are used on common daily instruments like your laptop or your phone to give it the light that it gets. So you can imagine the demand of these materials. Now, these materials come from largely places like Myanmar, where the internal instability, the insurgent groups in these countries are being manipulated, because they control a large amount of these mining areas. So we have to understand it in this light. That's why it's not that easy for GOI just to come in and make sweeping, statements and, say that, oh, we'll be able to sort this out once and for all. No, it doesn't work like that. They've done a brilliant job. We must give credit. But this, we also have to accept, has a lot of impact from countries across our border.
Thank you so much. Next question. Jairam Gopalan, thank you so much for being a member for 3 months. Bharat wins in 2023 and post-23, BJP in 23-24. Thank you. Next question. Jyotishpati wants to know, does Myanmar getting funding, is Myanmar getting funding from Soros? Also, is China plotting any new problems during election time?
See, I wouldn't be able to answer what sort of funding Soros would be doing, but Myanmar is a complicated place, because again, Myanmar has China on one end, has been alienated by the international community, has internal instability, massive internal instability in terms of insurgent groups, different ethnic identities that maybe counter Burmese nationalism as well. So as world economies grow, this is what I'll have to say. Geostrategic competition for resources that Myanmar has will increase. And in India's northeastern frontier is where what we call the Great Game East, it was a term made very popular by 𝗣𝗚𝘅 𝗍𝗏, is going to unfold. We've already seen the Great Game West happen on the northwestern frontier. And now we see the Great Game East, because Myanmar is so resource rich. Myanmar is a strategically located country. Myanmar is India's gateway to Southeast Asia. So if you were to ask me what my assessment, and solely my assessment, was, I'd say that, of course, there would be many countries that would be invested in not seeing India grow, in not in wanting India not to fulfill its ambitions in Southeast Asia. Manipur's gateway to Southeast Asia is Moreh, and Moreh has been impacted by this conflict. Moreh was to be the gateway, which was the golden gateway, which was to open up Northeast India, and then not just Northeast India, but the rest of the country to all of Southeast Asia, and which would open up completely new markets for us, but also make India into a balancing power in this region. I am sure that China would not be very happy, because China has its own interests in these areas. China also has its own debt trap policy that it plays in areas like Myanmar, where you see huge amount of like I said, a huge amount of instability. So I would limit my answer to that.
Thank you so much. And let's go to the next question here. One moment. Pardeep Shori wants to know any factual evidence regarding Kuki looking to start their own sovereign carve-out in Manipur, separate state.
See, there's always been this idea. So the Kukis, we also have to, we have to appreciate the fact that the Kukis have been a part of these communities. They have been an integral part of this country. They have played great roles in the national integrity of India. But yes, there are always factions that have, so there's this idea of 𝗤𝙤𝙤𝘀𝑆, it's like a greater land for all ethnic tribes that have come together. But, again, this is a very complicated matter, because there are Kukis, then there are sub tribes, there are, these are not one homogeneous umbrella terms. So just the way the Nagas is not one term. Under the Nagas, you have multiple sub tribes. So the same way under the Kukis, you have several sub tribes. You have what are called the Chins on the other side. Another Myanmarese name for the Kukis. So you have all these different dimensions to it. But yes, there has been an idea of 𝗤𝙤𝙤𝘀𝑆. There has been some factions, not all of them. Some factions have called for the idea of Greater Kuki land. So there are factions, there are vested interests, there are groups of people, and we must never sort of blanket that the entire community is like that. There are factions within communities that have certain vested interests in promoting this sort of separatist ideologies, and we have seen that here as well, in terms of the idea of 𝗤𝙤𝙤𝘀𝑆, which really means bringing together all these tribes that come from the same ethnic linguistic groups who consider themselves sub-tribes of the same umbrella into one larger landmass.
Thank you so much, Ramiji. That brings us to a close of today's program. Viewers, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to click on the bell button for notifications. Namaskar.
Thank you.